The war had lasted 11 years, and nobody remembered why it started anymore. But everyone remembered the dead. And the dead numbered in billions across 100 burning worlds where families once lived and children once played. Before the guns came and turned everything to ash and silence, Queen Saithra Velkorn sat upon her floating throne in the great chamber of the neutral station called Axis Veritas, and her violet eyes moved slowly across the human delegation that stood before her like small creatures waiting to be judged by a god they did not believe in. She was tall, as all Valkyrie were tall, standing at nearly 9 feet with 4 powerful arms and skin that shimmered like oil on water, changing colors with her mood. And right now that skin was dark purple with contempt because these humans had somehow fought her empire to a standstill, and she could not understand how the Valkyrie were born for war, bred for it across 10,000 years of conquest and glory. And their bodies were living weapons with claws that could tear through metal and reflexes faster than any computer could calculate. Yet these soft pink creatures from a single unremarkable planet had held the line against them. It made no sense to her. And things that made no sense made her angry. The peace treaty lay before them all, projected in light above the central table. And its terms were simple in the way that sharp knives are simple. And the sharpest term of all was this. The Valkyrie demanded a human consort for their queen, as proof that humanity accepted its lesser position in the galaxy. The human admiral, a gray-haired woman named Chun with eyes like winter ice, had agreed to this demand. But with one condition, that the humans would choose who this consort would be. And the Valkyrie had laughed at this, because what did it matter which sheep walked into the lion's den? "Bring forward your offering," Queen Saithra commanded. And her voice echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across mountains. And every Valkyrie noble present leaned forward with cruel smiles, because they wanted to see what pathetic creature humanity would sacrifice. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened with a soft hiss, and a single human walked through them, and the Valkyrie court began to laugh. He was young, perhaps 27 years by human counting, with broad shoulders and a strong build, but still so small compared to the warriors around him. And he wore a simple military uniform without medals or decorations. And his hands were rough with scars that spoke of work and violence. His hair was dark and cut short, and his eyes were gray like storm clouds, and those eyes did not look down or away as he walked the long path toward the throne. And that was the first thing Queen Saithra noticed about him. He was not afraid. Captain Marcus Cole stopped at the proper distance from the throne and stood at attention, and his face showed nothing but calm patience. And when the laughter of the court finally died away, he spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner. "Your Majesty, I am Marcus Cole of the Terran Coalition, and I come to fulfill the terms of the treaty." Queen Saithra leaned forward on her throne, and her 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of mocking welcome, and her sharp teeth showed him what might have been a smile. "This is your offering," she said to Admiral Chun, and her voice dripped with amusement like poison from a blade. "A common soldier with no title and no blood and no worth beyond the meat on his bones. Is this how humanity shows respect to the Valkyrie throne?" Admiral Chun's expression did not change as she replied. "He volunteered, Your Majesty, and he was chosen above 10,000 other volunteers because we believe he represents the best of what humanity can be." The court laughed again, harder this time, because what could this small creature possibly represent except humanity's desperation and weakness? But Marcus Cole did not react to the laughter, and his gray eyes remained fixed on the queen. And there was something in that gaze that made Saithra pause for just a moment. Something steady and unbreakable like stone at the heart of a mountain. "You volunteered for this," she said to him directly. And there was genuine curiosity beneath her contempt. "You volunteered to leave your home and your people, and come live among those who have killed millions of your kind. Why would any creature choose such a fate? Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before he answered, because someone had to. Your Majesty, and because I believe that peace is worth any personal sacrifice, and because I wanted to understand your people rather than just fight them. Understand us, Saithra repeated. And now her amusement was real rather than performed. Little human. My people have spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of war while yours were still living in caves and hitting each other with rocks. What could you possibly hope to understand about us? Everything. Your Majesty, given enough time. The confidence in his voice made several nobles hiss with anger. And one of them, a massive warrior named Verkith, who stood nearly 10 feet tall, stepped forward with his claws extended. Let me teach this creature its place, Verkith growled. One lesson is all it will take to break this false courage. Queen Saithra considered this offer for a long moment, watching Marcus Cole's face for any sign of fear, and finding none. And that absence of fear intrigued her more than she wanted to admit. No, she said finally. And Verkith stepped back with obvious disappointment. This human is now my consort by treaty law, and harming him would be an insult to my own throne. But then here her smile grew sharp and hungry. There will be plenty of time for lessons once we return to Kitharus Prime. She rose from her throne, all 9 feet of her unfolding with predatory grace, and she walked down the steps toward Marcus until she stood directly before him, close enough that he had to crane his neck to meet her eyes. Do you understand what you have agreed to, little human? She asked softly, and her voice was almost gentle, now in the way that a cat is gentle with a mouse it plans to kill slowly. You will live among predators who see you as prey. You will be mocked and tested and broken, and no one will come to save you because your people have already written you off as dead. Marcus looked up at her without flinching, and his gray eyes held hers, and when he spoke, his voice was just as soft but somehow just as strong. I understand, Your Majesty, and I am ready. Something flickered in Saithra's violet eyes then, something she could not name and did not want to examine, and she turned away from him with a swirl of her ceremonial robes. Then let us go home, little consort, and we shall see how long your courage lasts. As she walked away, she did not see the small smile that crossed Marcus Cole's face, and she did not know that she had just invited a storm into her palace, a quiet storm that would shake the foundations of everything her people believed. Admiral Chen watched them go, and she allowed herself one small nod of satisfaction, because she knew something that the Valkyrie Queen did not know yet, something that all of humanity knew in their bones from thousands of years of surviving against impossible odds. Humans were not strong because they were big or fast or powerful. Humans were strong because they never, ever gave up. The palace of Kitharus Prime rose from the purple plains like a mountain of black glass, and Marcus Cole stood at the window of his small chamber, looking out at a world that wanted him dead. And he smiled because he had work to do. His quarters were better than a prison cell, but not by much. A single room with a hard bed and a small bathroom and nothing else. Located in a forgotten corner of the palace where servants rarely walked and nobles never visited. And this was exactly where the Valkyrie wanted him, out of sight and out of mind, like a piece of furniture that embarrassed its owners. The first month was the hardest because everyone he met treated him like an animal that had somehow learned to walk on 2 legs. Servants spat near his feet when they passed him in the corridors, and guards made jokes about humans in loud voices whenever he was nearby, and nobles looked through him as if he were made of glass. And through it all, Marcus said nothing and showed nothing and simply watched and learned. He requested books from the palace library, and the librarian laughed in his face. But Marcus asked again the next day and the day after that, and the day after that, until the librarian finally gave him access. just to make him stop asking. The books were written in Valkyrie script, which no human had ever learned to read. And the scholars said it would take a decade for a human brain to understand their complex language. But Marcus did not care what the scholars said. He studied for 18 hours every day, filling notebook after notebook with translations and grammar rules and vocabulary. And he did not sleep more than 4 hours, because sleep was a luxury he could not afford. And slowly the strange symbols began to make sense to him. By the end of the second month, he could read simple texts. By the end of the third month, he could speak Valkyrie fluently, enough to hold conversations when he addressed a noble and perfect high Valkyrie, using the formal grammar that took Valkyrie children years to master. The noble's 4 eyes went wide with shock, and words spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. The human consort had learned their language in 90 days. Queen Sathra heard this news while sitting in her private chambers, and she put down the report she was reading and stared at the wall for a long time. And for the first time, she wondered what else this human might be capable of. But language was only the beginning of what Marcus intended to learn. He began visiting the combat pits where Valkyrie warriors trained, and at first they drove him away with threats and thrown objects. But he kept coming back day after day until they grew tired of chasing him off and simply ignored him instead. He sat in the shadows and watched them fight for hours, studying their techniques and their weaknesses and their patterns. And he saw things that they could not see because they were too close to their own traditions. And he stored all of this knowledge away for when he would need it. One day, a young warrior named Kethra approached him with curiosity rather than contempt. And this warrior was different from the others because she had traveled beyond Valkyrie space and had seen humans fight during the war. "You study us like a predator studies prey," she said, and there was something like respect in her voice. "What do you hope to learn, little human?" "Everything," Marcus replied. "I want to understand how you move and how you think and how you fight, because understanding is the first step toward connection." Kethra laughed, but it was not a cruel laugh. "You are strange for a human, and I think perhaps your people chose well when they chose you." She became his first teacher, showing him the basic forms of Valkyrie combat. And Marcus learned quickly because he had always learned quickly. And soon he could hold his own against the training dummies even if he could not yet face a living opponent. Word of this also spread through the palace, and it reached the ears of a noble named Lord Verkith, the same warrior who had wanted to teach Marcus his place on the day of the treaty signing. And Verkith decided that the time had come to crush this uppity human once and for all. The challenge came on a cold morning when the purple sun was just rising over the black glass towers. And Verkith stood in the center of the main combat pit with his 4 arms spread wide and his voice booming across the palace grounds. "I challenge the human consort to Calvareth," he roared. And every Valkyrie within hearing distance stopped what they were doing because Calvareth was a formal duel that could not be refused without eternal shame. Let him prove that he is worthy to breathe the same air as the Valkyrie people. Marcus walked into the pit with calm steps, and he looked up at the massive warrior who stood nearly 4 feet taller than him. And he bowed in the traditional way that Kethra had taught him. "I accept the challenge," he said in perfect Valkyrie. And the crowd that had gathered murmured with surprise. The fight began, and it was brutal from the first moment. Verkith was fast and strong and skilled, and his 4 arms moved like striking serpents. And his first blow caught Marcus across the chest and sent him flying backward into the sand. Marcus rose. The second blow broke something in his ribs, and he could feel the sharp pain with every breath. But he set his feet and raised his guard and waited for the next attack. He rose. The third blow split his lip and filled his mouth with blood, and the 4th blow knocked him down again. And the crowd began to cheer because they were watching exactly what they expected to watch: a weak human being destroyed by a superior warrior. But Marcus rose. He rose after the fifth blow and the sixth and the seventh. And something changed in the crowd's cheering as they watched this small creature refuse to stay down. And by the 10th blow, there was no more cheering at all. Verkith was breathing hard now, his forearms trembling with exertion, because he had expected this fight to last seconds, and it had now stretched to 15 minutes. And still the human would not stay down. "Why do you keep rising?" Verkith demanded. And there was frustration in his voice now rather than contempt. "You cannot win this fight. Accept your defeat with dignity." Marcus spat blood onto the sand and raised his fists again. "I did not come here to win," he said. And his voice was steady despite the pain that radiated through his entire body. "I came here to show you something." "Show me what?" Verkith asked. "That I will never stop getting up." The fight continued for another 28 minutes. And Marcus was knocked down 17 more times, and each time he rose again. Slower now, broken in a dozen places, but still rising. Always rising, when he finally could not rise anymore. When his body simply refused to obey his will, he lay in the sand and looked up at Verkith and said in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the pit, "Same time tomorrow." And then he passed out. He woke in the medical wing with Kethra sitting beside his bed. And she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on a Volcari face before, something like wonder mixed with confusion. "The healers say you have broken ribs and a fractured arm and internal bleeding," she said softly. "They say you should be dead from the damage you took, but your heart keeps beating. And I do not understand how." Marcus smiled through his split lips. "Humans are stubborn," he said. "We do not know when to quit." High above the medical wing, in her private chambers, Queen Sathra stood at her window and looked down at the lights of the palace below. And she thought about the reports she had received about the fight. And she thought about a small human who had risen 24 times against impossible odds. She did not understand him, but she wanted to. 6 months had passed since Marcus Cole arrived on Kithris Prime. And in that time, the galaxy had grown darker and more dangerous. And an old enemy had returned from the void between stars to threaten everything the Volcari had built. The Rethkari swarm came without warning, pouring out of the galactic rim like a tide of chitinous nightmares. Millions of insectoid creatures controlled by a single hive mind that knew only hunger and conquest. And within weeks, they had consumed 3 Volcari colony worlds and were pushing deeper into Imperial space. Queen Sathra called her high command to the war chamber, and the greatest generals of the Dominion gathered around the massive holographic display that showed the spreading infection of swarm territory. And their faces were grim because they remembered the last war against the Rethkari. 200 years ago, when the Volcari had barely survived, Marcus was there too, standing in the shadows at the edge of the room because no one had bothered to remove him. And he had learned that being forgotten meant being allowed to watch. And he watched carefully as the generals argued about strategy and deployment and honor. "We must meet them in open battle," General Cothford declared, slamming his fist on the table with a boom that echoed through the chamber. "The Volcari way is the way of strength. We do not hide from our enemies like cowards." "The Eastern Fleet stands ready," another general added. "Give us the order, and we will crush these insects beneath our boots as our ancestors did before us." Marcus listened to plan after plan, and each one was built on the same foundation of direct confrontation and overwhelming force. And each one would fail for the same reasons that had made the last Rethkari war so devastating. He should have stayed silent because he was nothing here, just a political symbol with no voice and no power. But he thought about the billions of lives that would be lost if these generals had their way. And he could not keep his mouth shut. "You are going to lose." His voice cut through the chamber like a blade, and every head turned toward him. And the expressions ranged from shock to outrage to murderous fury. The human dares to speak in a war council. General Kothvar growled, and his four hands reached for the ceremonial blade at his hip. Remove this creature before I remove its head. Wait, Queen Saithra said. And her voice was calm, but carried absolute authority. And even Kothvar froze at the sound of it. Let him speak. She turned her violet eyes toward Marcus. And there was something in her gaze that had not been there 6 months ago. Not respect, exactly, but acknowledgement that this human had earned the right to be heard. Explain yourself. Consort. Marcus stepped forward into the light. And he did not flinch from the hostile stares that surrounded him because he had faced worse in the training pits. The Rethkari do not care about your traditions or your honor or your way of war, he said. And his voice was steady and clear. They are not an enemy that will meet you in glorious battle. They are a swarm that will overwhelm you with numbers and consume everything you throw at them. You insult our warriors. Kothvar spat. I am trying to save them, Marcus replied. Your strategies are built on the assumption that the enemy will fight like Volkari. But the swarm does not fight like Valkyrie. They fight like a force of nature, like a flood or a fire. And you cannot defeat a flood by standing in front of it and demanding it fight you with honor. Queen Saithra leaned forward on her throne. Then how do you defeat a flood? Human. You redirect it. You break it into smaller streams that can be managed. You attack its source rather than its waves. And you do not waste your strength fighting battles that cannot be won. He walked to the holographic display and began manipulating it with hands that had learned Valkyrie technology through months of secret study. And the generals watched in stunned silence as he showed them something they had never considered. The swarm extends its territory like a living organism. And like any organism, it needs to feed, Marcus explained. These supply lines here and here are how they sustain their expansion. They are weak points in an enemy that seems to have no weaknesses. You suggest we attack supply lines instead of fleets, one general said with disgust. This is cowardice. This is survival, Marcus corrected. My people learned long ago that there is no honor in losing, only in winning by whatever means necessary. And if humanity had fought our wars the way you fight yours, we would have been extinct 10,000 years ago. He showed them maps and projections and calculations, laying out a strategy built on guerrilla tactics and surgical strikes and psychological warfare. Concepts that the honor-bound Valkyrie had never developed because they had never needed them. You want us to fight like humans, Kothvar said. And the words were clearly meant as an insult. I want you to survive, Marcus answered. And right now the Valkyrie way is the path to extinction. I am offering you another path. The chamber erupted in argument. Generals shouting at each other and at Marcus and at the queen herself. And the noise grew so loud that Saithra had to raise her voice to cut through it. Enough, she commanded, and silence fell instantly. I have made my decision. She stood from her throne and walked down the steps until she stood beside Marcus. And the symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. The queen of the Volkari Dominion standing next to her human consort as an equal. The human will advise the Eastern campaign, she announced. He will work with General Vethris to implement his strategies. And any who refuse to follow his counsel will answer to me personally. The shock in the room was total and absolute. Your Majesty, this is unprecedented. Kothvar protested. A human commanding Volkari forces is an insult to every warrior who has died for the Dominion. He is not commanding, Saithra corrected. He is advising, and I suggest you remember the difference before you question my decisions again. General Kothvar fell silent, but his eyes burned with hatred as he looked at Marcus. And Marcus knew that he had made a powerful enemy today. Later, when the council had disbanded and the generals had gone to prepare their forces, Saithra found Marcus alone on one of the palace balconies, looking up at the alien stars that had become familiar to him over the past 6 months. "You have made enemies today," she said. Coming to stand beside him, Kothvar will not forget this humiliation. And others feel the same, even if they hide it better. "I know," Marcus said. "But your people are going to die by the millions if someone does not change the way this war is fought. And I would rather be hated and useful than liked and useless." Saithra studied his profile in the starlight. This small creature who had somehow become the most controversial figure in her empire. "Why do you care so much about saving Valkyrie lives?" she asked quietly. "We treated you as less than nothing when you arrived. And many still do. You owe us no loyalty." Marcus was silent for a long moment before he answered. "Because someone has to," he said finally. "And because I believe that enemies can become allies if someone is willing to build the bridge between them. And I volunteered for this position to build that bridge, even if I have to build it with my own body." Saithra felt something shift in her chest, something she did not have a name for. And she turned away before he could see the confusion in her eyes. "Do not make me regret giving you this chance, human," she said as she walked away. "The future of my people depends on it." "I will not fail you, your majesty," Marcus replied. And the certainty in his voice followed her long after she had left the balcony. He had been given an army to advise. Now he had to prove that everything he believed about humanity was true. The Eastern Front stretched across 12 star systems, and each one was bleeding under the relentless assault of the Rethkari swarm. And into this nightmare stepped Marcus Cole with nothing but his mind and his will and a desperate hope that he could make a difference. General Vethris met him at the forward command station with skepticism written across her scale face. But she was a practical warrior who cared more about results than tradition. And she had lost too many soldiers in the last 3 months to dismiss any potential advantage. "The Queen commands that I listen to your counsel," she said. Her forearms crossed in a posture of guarded assessment. "So speak. Human, what wisdom do you bring to a war you have never fought?" "I bring a different perspective," Marcus replied. "And sometimes that is more valuable than experience." He asked to see the front lines, and Vethris expected him to observe from the safety of a command ship. But Marcus insisted on going to the surface of Vathos Prime, where Valkyrie soldiers were dying by the hundreds every day. When he walked through the trenches for the first time, the soldiers stared at him with open hostility, because they had heard stories about the human consort who thought he could teach Valkyrie how to fight. And they had lost brothers and sisters and friends to an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Marcus did not try to command them or impress them. He simply asked their names. He sat with them in the mud and the blood and listened to their stories about fallen comrades and impossible battles. And he learned things that no report could have told him about morale and fear and the small moments of courage that held an army together. "Why do you care about our names?" a young soldier asked him one night, her voice rough with exhaustion and grief. "We are just numbers to the generals, replaceable parts in a machine of war." "Because you are not numbers to me," Marcus answered. "You are people, and people deserve to be remembered." Word spread through the trenches about the strange human who walked among them and talked to them and seemed to actually see them. And slowly the hostility began to fade into something that might have been respect. But respect would not win the war, only victory could do that. And victory required a plan that no one believed could work. The Battle of Vathos Station was meant to be the swarm's killing blow against the Eastern Fleet. 80,000 Valkyrie soldiers defending an orbital platform against a force that outnumbered them 8-1. And every conventional analysis said that the defense would fail within hours. General Vethris prepared to order a direct confrontation, massing her forces for a glorious last stand that would be sung about in Valkyrie ballads for generations to come. Marcus stopped her. "Order a retreat," he said. And the words hit the command deck like a bomb. "You ask me to shame my soldiers," Vethris growled. to run from the enemy like frightened children. This is not the Valkyrie way. The Valkyrie way will get everyone killed. Marcus replied, "But if you trust me, if you follow my plan exactly as I describe it, I can give you a victory that will change the course of this war." He laid out his strategy on the tactical display, showing her the asteroid field behind Vathos Station and the Terran-designed antimatter charges that could be placed there, and showing her how a feigned retreat would draw the swarm into a killing ground of humanity's design. "You want us to run so that we can explode rocks at our enemy," Vethra said, and her voice was thick with disbelief. "This is madness. This is how humans win wars we should not be able to win," Marcus said. "We use our enemy's strength against them. The swarm cannot resist pursuing a fleeing opponent because their hive mind does not understand the concept of a trap." Vethra stared at him for a long moment, and then she made a decision that went against everything she had been taught since childhood. All forces, she commanded over the fleet-wide channel, begin tactical withdrawal towards Sector 7. This is not a retreat. This is a repositioning, and I will personally execute anyone who questions this order. The retreat began, and it looked exactly like what the swarm expected to see: a broken enemy fleeing before their overwhelming numbers. Easy prey to be consumed and forgotten, 60 million Rethkari surged forward in pursuit, their chitinous bodies blackening the stars as they poured into the asteroid field, and their hive mind screamed with triumph because victory was moments away. Marcus watched the tactical display with cold focus, counting the enemy forces as they entered the kill zone. And when the number reached critical mass, he spoke 3 words: "Detonate the charges." The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away, a brief new sun that burned in the void and then faded. And when the light cleared, there was nothing left of the swarm, assault force, but scattered debris and silence. 60 million Rethkari. Gone in an instant. The command deck erupted in cheers. Valkyrie soldiers embracing each other and weeping with joy and disbelief. And General Vethris turned to Marcus with an expression he had never seen on a Valkyrie face before: pure and absolute respect. "You did it," she said, and her voice was hoarse with emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it together," Marcus corrected. "Your soldiers executed the plan perfectly. I only showed them a different way to fight." News of the victory spread across the Dominion like wildfire, and suddenly everyone was talking about the human consort who had delivered the first decisive victory in 6 months. And opinions that had been set in stone began to crack and shift. But Marcus did not rest on his success. He continued, walking the trenches and learning the names of soldiers and sharing meals with warriors who had once wanted him dead. And he showed them that he was not just a strategist, but a leader who would stand beside them in the darkness when the swarm counterattacked at the Battle of Callus Moon. Marcus was on the ground with the infantry, fighting beside them with a Valkyrie blade in his hands. And when the line began to break, he stood in the gap and held it through sheer stubborn refusal to die. A Rethkari warrior twice his size lunged at him with mandibles that could bite through steel. And Marcus dodged and struck and dodged again, moving with the desperate grace of a creature fighting for survival. And when the battle was over, he was covered in alien blood and his own, and he was still standing. The soldiers who had watched him fight began calling him Kelveth, which meant one who does not fall in their language. And the name spread through the ranks until it reached the ears of the queen herself. In the medical tent after the battle, Marcus sat beside a dying soldier named Version, holding his hand as the light faded from his 4 eyes. "Why you fight for us?" Version whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of grief and healing around them. "We treated you as nothing. We mocked you and hurt you and tried to break you." Marcus squeezed his hand gently. "Because you are people," he said simply. And people are worth fighting for. No matter how they treated me in the past, that is what I believe. And I will not stop believing it until my heart stops beating. Vershine smiled then, a peaceful expression that seemed strange on a warrior's face. I understand now, he said. I understand why your people survived against us. You are stronger than you look. He died with his hand still in Marcus's grip. And Marcus said a prayer in Velkhari and in English, honoring a soldier who had started as an enemy and ended as something closer to a friend, far away on Kithra's prime. Queen Sathra watched the battle recordings and the testimonies and the footage of her human consort standing in the breach with nothing but courage and steel. And she felt tears sliding down her face for the first time in 100 years. She did not understand these feelings, but she could no longer deny that they were real. 1 year had passed since Marcus Cole walked into the Velkhari court as a sacrifice. And now he stood at the center of the greatest crisis the Dominion had ever faced. And the choice before Queen Sathra would determine the fate of two civilizations. The Rethkari Hive Queen had sent her ultimatum through channels that could not be ignored. Surrender the human called Marcus Cole, and the swarm would withdraw from Velkhari space, forever refuse. And the full might of the Hive would descend upon Kithra's prime itself. The High Council gathered in emergency session, and their arguments filled the throne room like poison gas. The solution is obvious, General Kothva declared, his hatred for Marcus burning as bright as it had on the first day. Give them the human and end this war. One life for the survival of our species is a trade any rational being would accept. He has won us 3 major victories, another counselor argued. But his voice was weak with fear. Surely that earns him some consideration. Consideration does not stop the swarm, Kothva snapped. The Hive Queen wants this human for reasons we do not understand. But her desire gives us leverage we would be fools to waste. I say we deliver him to her in chains and celebrate our salvation. Queen Sathra sat on her throne and listened to the arguments wash over her like waves against stone. And she thought about the report she had read and the footage she had watched and the strange human who had turned her empire upside down. She thought about how he had learned their language in 90 days. She thought about how he had risen 24 times against Verketh in the combat pit. She thought about how he had walked the trenches and learned of us, names of common soldiers and held dying warriors in his arms as they passed from this world to the next. She thought about the way he looked at her sometimes, with gray eyes that saw past the crown and the power to something beneath. Something she had not allowed anyone to see in centuries, Your Majesty, Kothva pressed. The decision cannot wait. The Hive Queen has given us 1 day to respond. Sathra rose from her throne, and the room fell silent. 1 year ago, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. A human walked into this room and offered himself as a sacrifice for peace. And we laughed at him because we thought he was weak. She walked down the steps from her throne, her 4 arms spread in the gesture of absolute authority that her ancestors had used for 10,000 years. We were wrong. The council stared at her with shock and confusion. Marcus Cole has bled for this empire, Sathra continued. He has fought beside our soldiers and mourned our dead and taught us how to win a war we were losing. He has done more for the Velkhari people in 1 year than most of this council has done in a century. Your Majesty, he's just a human, Kothva protested. He is my consort, Sathra said, and her voice dropped to a dangerous softness. He is Velkhari by treaty and by deed and by the blood he has shed in our name, and we do not surrender our own. She turned to face the council with violet eyes that burned like dying stars. We fight, she declared. All of us, together Velkhari and human, united against a common enemy. And if we fall, then we fall with honor intact rather than as cowards who traded a hero for a temporary peace. "The Hive Queen will destroy us," Kothver said. "Then let her try." The final battle came 3 weeks later at the Rimward Gate, the last defensive line before the Valkyrie homeworld. And the swarm came in numbers that blocked out the stars. Marcus stood on the bridge of the flagship beside Queen Sathra, and for the first time they faced annihilation together as equals. "If we lose today," Sathra said quietly, "I want you to know that I do not regret my choice. I would rather die fighting beside you than live knowing I had betrayed everything you taught me about strength." Marcus looked at her. This magnificent alien queen who had gone from seeing him as a pet to seeing him as a partner. And he smiled. "We are not going to lose," he said. "But if we do, there is no one I would rather fall beside." The battle raged across 1,000 kilometers of space. Valkyrie ships and Terran reinforcements fighting side by side against the endless tide of the swarm. And slowly the tide began to turn as Marcus's strategies and Sathra's leadership combined into something neither species could have achieved alone. But the Hive Queen herself remained untouchable at the heart of her swarm, protected by millions of her children. And until she fell, the war would never truly end. Marcus made his choice. I'm taking a boarding party to the Hive Queen's bioship," he announced. And Sathra grabbed his arm with 2 of her hands. "That is suicide," she said. And there was something in her voice that sounded almost like desperation. "No one has ever breached a Hive Queen's vessel and survived. No Valkyrie has ever breached a Hive Queen's vessel," Marcus corrected. "But I am human, and humans have a tradition of doing impossible things when everything depends on it." He assembled a team of 12 volunteers, warriors who had fought beside him in the trenches and who trusted him with their lives. And they launched toward the massive organic ship at the center of the swarm. The breach was brutal and bloody, fighting through corridors of living tissue and acid and chitinous horrors. And by the time they reached the central chamber, only Marcus and 2 others remained standing. The Hive Queen waited for them there, a massive insectoid creature 3 times the size of a Valkyrie, with mandibles that could crush steel and eyes that held the intelligence of 1 billion minds. "You are the human," she said, and her voice was like 1,000 whispers speaking in unison. "You are small. You are weak. You are mortal. Why do you fight so hard against the inevitable?" Marcus raised his blade, Valkyrie steel, gifted to him by soldiers who had once mocked him, and he faced the monster without fear. "Because I have something worth fighting for," he said. "I have people who believe in me, and I will not let them down." "Your people abandoned you," the Hive Queen hissed. "The Valkyrie despised you. You owe them nothing." "I owe them everything," Marcus replied. "Because they gave me a chance to prove that enemies can become allies, that hatred can become respect, that one person can make a difference, even when the odds are impossible." He charged. The fight was faster than thought and more brutal than any Marcus had ever experienced. The Hive Queen's limbs striking like lightning while Marcus dodged and weaved and struck back with everything he had. She was stronger than him. She was faster than him. She was ancient and powerful, beyond human comprehension. But Marcus Cole had spent a year getting knocked down and getting back up again. And he had learned that victory did not go to the strongest or the fastest, but to the one who refused to quit. He rose after every blow. He rose after every wound. He rose until finally, impossibly, his blade found its mark. The Hive Queen screamed as the Valkyrie steel pierced her central nerve cluster. And across the battlefield, her children faltered and broke as their controlling intelligence faded into darkness. Marcus stood over her body, covered in blood, both red and green. And he whispered words that only he could hear. "For everyone who believed in me, for everyone who gave me a chance." When the rescue team found him, he was barely alive. But he was alive. And the war was over. The celebration lasted for weeks. Valkyrie and humans rejoicing together in a victory that neither species could have won alone. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Cole and Queen Sathra, side by side on the balcony of the palace where everything had begun. "You could have let them take me," Marcus said quietly. Looking out at the crowds below, it would have been the rational choice. Sathra turned to face him, and for the first time she allowed him to see the full depth of emotion in her violet eyes. "You taught my people that strength is not just power," she said. "You taught us that strength is endurance, sacrifice, choosing to protect others even when it costs everything. You taught me that." She placed one of her hands on his shoulder, and the gesture was gentle in a way that Valkyrie had never been gentle before. "I could not surrender you because you had become part of my people," she said. "And I could not surrender you because—" She hesitated, searching for words in a language that had no name for what she felt. "Because I did not want to lose you." Marcus looked up at her. This alien queen who had traveled so far from where she started. And he smiled. "You will not lose me," he said. "I am exactly where I want to be." Below them the crowds cheered. Valkyrie voices and human voices joined together in celebration of a new era. And Marcus Cole stood beside the queen he had come to love and looked toward a future that neither of their species could have imagined a year ago. He was the consort who became a warrior. He was the outsider who became a legend. He was the 27-year-old human who turned to war. And he was finally home.